Actually, we already have around 40 people join us, so maybe we could start. So let me first thank you everyone for joining us for this week's Luohan Academy webinar. And today we're super honored to have Professor Zoe Cullen from Harvard Business School to join us and present her work on labor as capital, AI, and the ownership of expertise. And during the seminar, if you have any questions, please free to raise your hand or type your questions in the chat, and we will keep an eye on that. And I think at the end of the presentation, we hope to also leave several minutes for some additional questions that you might have. And without further delay, Professor Cullen, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Yes, it's a pleasure. Okay, so this is a fairly new presentation, and for that reason, I will be experimenting a little bit with the pace. So I'm going to try to slow down when I think it's quite important to understand a particular concept. But in order to preserve our Q&A at the end, I'm also probably going to skip slides as I see necessary. With that said, please interrupt me for clarification, because I would hate to have much of this pass by without it being clear. Okay, so this is joint work with Danielle Lee, who's at MIT, and Shengwu Li, who's here at Harvard. And the operative phrase that I'd like you to take away from the project is labor as capital, or labor as data, an asset. Okay, so, oops. Workers currently are often surveilled on the job. And this comes in many forms. Often the surveillance is pitched to workers as a way of tracking performance. So customer service calls are recorded for quality assurance. Software engineers use version control systems. They show the process, how they're committing code, how they merge and pull requests. We have warehouse workers often wearing wearables so that the motions can be mimicked, and robotics can potentially be using these tracking devices as input. And then personally, I also upload all my teaching notes so that HBS could potentially use those data in the future. Now, the surveillance has always been an important part of the work process, and now more so than ever, it has this productivity potential as training data for generative AI models. So these models may be used to perform some of the same tasks as workers based on the data that they've generated in the process of working. The question we have is, what does it mean for work and for workers? So labor expertise is traditionally embodied. Workers would gain expertise through time-consuming training and experience, and this has always been difficult to articulate and transfer. And so labor expertise has always been closely tied to our physical bodies, and we model labor as something you rent out. So each day the employer has to convince you to come back again tomorrow to finish or make progress on whatever you've done. And of course, it's subject to all human limitations of needing sleep and health insurance, etc. Now, to the extent that AI models can capture some of worker skills, it creates models of worker behavior, including the tacit skills that are often hard to articulate without generative AI models mapping those tacit patterns. To the extent it can do this, it actually decouples the individual, the body, from the work itself. And the product looks like capital or an asset that can be owned, it can be scaled, modified, etc. Now, of course, this means that there's potentially large changes on the horizon, potentially many large productivity gains, but we want to raise the question of what this means about ownership and rights and the extent to which these ownership and rights are going to affect the direction of the technology and then the surplus division as well. So just to give you a perspective on this, I'm going to share with you a quote from an actor who is writing about this in July of 2023. So really at the early stages of when ChatGPT had made its rounds with a direct-to-consumer product. So Joseph Gordon-Levitt is saying, but if I had known that by signing this contract and allowing the studio to be the movie's sole copyright holder, I would then be allowing the studio to use that intellectual property as training data for AI, that would put me out of a job forever. I would never have signed that contract. So Hollywood, probably because of the nature of the types of work in Hollywood, have often left a long trail of data. And because the codified nature of work in Hollywood is so salient and has been for many decades, it is not surprising that it is an actor here writing about the fear that once they hand over the content, they will, and that content can be modified and improved, they might not have as much work in the future themselves. Now, Joseph Gordon-Levitt is also going on to say that it's not just about Hollywood. He decides to also describe doctors. So doctors sign contracts that allow hospitals or whoever to take ownership of the medical records. But if the doctors had known that intellectual property would be used as training data for AI that would put them out of a job, they too would never have signed those contracts. So the emphasis in both cases is really on like what doctors and actors might have done differently had they been able to anticipate the way in which their data could be used. And an important part of this overall project is realizing that we're in a time and place now where awareness is partial. So some people are acting as though they anticipate this and others not so. So what we're going to do in this paper is first going to ask how will workers react, and when they become aware, what will they want? And the way we're going to do this is through a survey experiment of employed workers in the US. They're recruited through Prolific, which is a survey platform, but we're screening for people who are full-time employed, and we're going to randomize awareness. So we're going to provide truthful information about how work can be used to build AI models. And I'll get into the details of how that's done. Then the second part of the paper is theoretical. And the question we want to ask with the theory combined with the results from the experiment is, what should workers want and what should we want as a society? So we want to develop a model of knowledge supply, which we can think of as distinct from labor supply. And once we have a model of knowledge supply, we want to think about different policies and their implications. Namely, we're going to start with the status quo, where the employer just by default owns all the data that is collected on the job. And under that status quo, we can show from evidence in our survey experiment that workers have an incentive to withhold their knowledge. And the reason for this is multifactored, but one is just their career incentives. They want to protect the rents that they might get in the future by withholding data from the model that can sort of do some of what they do. And we show theoretically that this can lead AI to actually be Pareto worse than having no AI at all. The reason for that is that with no AI at all, or with no awareness, there's no withholding. There's no strategic withholding of knowledge supply. And so it's this strategic withholding of knowledge supply that can put us in a worse situation than if we didn't have surveillance and AI at all. And then we want to consider alternative policies that have come up anecdotally and also in worker strikes. The idea that individuals should have to consent before the firm can use their data for other purposes aside from what their direct labor is. And so in certain cases we've seen, especially in Hollywood, their consent has become default the norm. And we want to see how that changes the outcome, both the innovation and also worker surplus. And then for reasons that'll become clear, we also think it's important to consider what might happen if we allowed for collective ownership of the data and models by workers. Okay, so now let me just give you some background, because while the empirics from Prolific are insightful, in fact, you can actually look historically and see a lot of evidence of the same thing that we're documenting formally in the survey experiment, just through texts that have been collected over the years. Let me start with this Hayek quote. This is from 1945, a book, The Use of Knowledge in Society. So the point that Hayek is making here is that the workplace is full of tacit, particular knowledge that's possessed by individual workers. So the quote here, there's beyond question a body of very important but unorganized knowledge. It's the knowledge of the particular circumstances of time and place. And it's with respect to this that practically every individual has some advantage over all others in that he possesses unique information of which beneficial use might be made. This is like a sense in which each individual has some power and knowledge that perhaps has not yet been captured or would be hard to capture by the employer. So data on the worker expertise is valuable. It has always been valuable. Modern AI is often trained on examples generated by human labor. And currently, it's been largely without awareness, consent, or pay. We think that human data is going to continue to be important for the further development of AI and adoption. So we know that many cases now have yet to be recorded. So most workplace expertise, if you think going forward into the future, has yet to be fully recorded and retained by the employer because there's firm-specific, client-specific, and time-specific knowledge. And we know from recent evidence that even when AI has been successful at capturing a task in a particular location, for example, medical imaging classifiers. Once you try to take that model and execute the same diagnostics using data from a different hospital, it performs worse, meaning that the firm's specific data is likely going to remain really essential. And of course, each enterprise collecting these data and using these data is going to require a lot more surveillance than has currently been put in place. Now, it's not new that this type of surveillance at the level of local workers has been considered by employers as critical. So data on worker expertise has really been valuable since Taylorism, which introduced this notion that if you can surveil workers and you can just copy it, or you can take notes on exactly the tasks that they do and the steps in their process, then you can break it down and make and improve the process of production. And this was during the Taylorism period, this was really foundational to productivity gains. So it had much of the same quality that we have that I'm talking about with generative AI, the difference being the scale and scope of what's possible. But if we look back to this period of Taylorism, we can see lots of evidence that workers understood what was happening, that their expertise was being codified and used to reduce their reliance on their expertise in the future. And so you see evidence captured by sociologists in the 50s documenting how workers stated to each other, one another, to coordinate around limiting the type of information that would transfer. So here's a quote on the right-hand side: "Don't let it go over $125 an hour or the time study man will be down here," because employers would start to codify and try to decompose a task as soon as it became expensive to pay for or appeared to be the bottleneck in a production process. So this is evidence of workers coordinating to prevent the time study man from focusing on codifying their work. And then you can see, if you fast forward to 2023, there's already conversations happening relating time motion studies to surveillance today. So this is quotes from workers that attended a conference. Here they're saying, "When we say that we will not take part in the rationalization process, what we mean is that workers should not contribute to de-skilling and further reducing the number of jobs," really taking ownership over this process. So even though our survey experiment is going to capture some of this withholding and this anticipatory strategic behavior, you can see lots more evidence of it in these historical documents during Taylorism. So now I'm just going to fast forward though to the context we have today. So digital surveillance. And as I mentioned, we think that this is going to just expand the scope of Taylorism. We've seen this happening in AI chat assistants trained on transcripts of agent conversations. We've seen this already happen to coding assistants that are trained on human code. And there's emerging applications that are also being studied by various researchers. The manufacturing robots trained using videos of worker movements, clinical decision support trained on physician logs, etc. So now we're going to think about what's happening in these kinds of contexts. And you can see informally, if you search the internet, even these informal Reddit threads, workers trying to figure out, how do I stop the screen monitoring by an employer? And lots of answers to this and strategic behavior, helping workers figure out how to keep their data protected. And I want to also highlight that it's not just informally we see the resistance, but actually formally in the context of strikes. Now, there's, of course, unions are a minority union membership is a minority of workers, the vast minority, about 11% of the US workforce. So, of course, these examples are limited to those cases where there's coverage. But you can see already in those cases that AI and limiting AI and thinking through what the right alternative policy for the data have cropped up. And this is going to be the inspiration for the types of counterfactuals that we consider in our theory. So let me just describe what these different groups have arrived at as a solution. And by solution, this is workers feeling as though they have been able to protect some of their surplus. Okay, so in the screenwriters strike of 2024, the Screenwriters Guild came to the conclusion that the right approach was to actually transfer ownership over AI models effectively from studios to writers. And the way they did this was by negotiating over the price that would the pay that would go to someone who is the original creator of the screenwriting play, and no AI model could get attribution or credit for the writing of that play. So if a worker used AI and AI wrote 100% of the screenplay, still it would be the worker that's named as the creator, and the worker would get the pay. So in this way, the worker effectively has ownership over the AI model. Then you saw the US longshoremen strike, where they tried to put direct limitations on adoption. So this is sort of essentially saying no AI. And here they put limits on how much robot adoption could happen in ports as a ratio to the number of workers who are hired. Then we had the SAG-AFTRA voice actors strike. This is where they insisted on having consent. So this is like individual ownership in the sense that the data could not be used by studios for future applications without consent. And of course, with consent can come side transfers or compensation for those data. And that's how they sort of reached an agreement. And then you saw also quite popular, perhaps now, but maybe not in the future, this ex post distribution of pay where, a body of work will be used by a model. And then in this case, when Anthropic was sued by actors, they would come up with a ex post payment for the types of data that were used in those models. So authors received a collective payment for unauthorized training. And there's, of course, economists trying to figure out what each piece of data is worth, which is a very hard problem independent. Okay, so this is the sense, give you a sense of the policies that we want to consider. And so moving forward, just I'll potentially reference these when we try to formalize it in a model. All right, so let me now describe to you the type of withholding that we can see in a survey experiment of US full-time workers. So the way this experiment works is workers are going to be asked to answer a lot of baseline questions about their workplace and about their knowledge of AI, and specifically about their knowledge around how AI performance is improved. And then through that, we know that a large share of workers, about 2/3, are unaware of the fact that their data is what makes the models of their work possible. So the treatment group is going to see a video that helps link the use of data with the performance of the model, and the control video is going to be exactly the same without that link between data and model performance. And then at the end, we're going to ask questions. Outcome questions are going to be about their intent to withhold. And in the case of prolific workers, we can ask incentivized questions about their willingness to share with us their past survey data and future survey data with the goal of modeling their survey answers. Okay, so this is the 2-minute treatment video. Everything that's in blue is treatment and control, and what's orange here is unique to the treatment. So there's a 2-minute video about AI in the workplace, and then the use of worker data in AI training for the treatment group. So it makes 3 points. The first point is that AI models are increasingly capable of performing aspects of human work. 2 is examples of what AI models can do. And then for the treatment group, with information on how worker data is used for the training. So call center recordings can be used to train AI chat assistants, screen interactions used to learn how to file an expense report, screen recordings to learn how to write a presentation. And then the third component of the treatment is to just describe how AI models are different from humans. They have access to more knowledge, can speak multiple languages, they don't get tired, they're easy to scale up. So this is for both treatment and control. And I'm just crossing out very explicitly what the control group would have seen. So they still get the examples of what AI models can do. They just don't see explicitly how those AI models are built. And this is just a picture of the opening screen. So this is the treatment video. So you can see this is a call center worker, and the call center worker is being surveilled, and that surveillance data is going to be used to train the data. And in the control group, it's a very similar example, but you don't get to see the process by which information is collected and used to create those chatbots. Okay, so how do we know how much the treatment video has actually changed people's perception? The way we do this is by describing a number of scenarios and asking workers after the treatment whether or not each of these options is important or critical in developing the AI model. So to be clear, somebody who understands the way that their data is used to perform the model is much more likely to highlight that it's examples of work produced by experts that's really critical in the performance of the model. And we're going to code anybody who highlights that as being critical for the AI performance model as getting the answer, quote, correct in that sense. So you can see on the right-hand side, I have a bar chart just to show you how treatment and control perform. So the control group gets on average 1 out of 3 scenarios correct in that they highlight the importance of human expert work. And in the treatment group, that rises to 1.6 questions out of 3 correct. So it's a 60% increase in this measure of awareness, but it's certainly not full awareness. And most workers or most populations had partial awareness to begin with. So this is moving the needle somewhat. Now let me just show you what the key findings are. First, I want to describe what a baseline question was that really highlights a feature of the workplace that we didn't know before. This is the question of how much of your expertise do you think would be lost if you were to leave your employer? And we describe very specific types of work processes. So software and system proficiency, communications, time and project management, internal collaboration and people management, etc. And for each of these types of work, the respondent is going to say yes or no, whether it's a core aspect of their job. And if it is a core aspect, then they're going to say how much they think of their expertise would be lost if they were to leave it. And the range is from no, very little, some, all the way to a lot. And something we didn't really understand before we started this work is that the vast majority of workers think that they possess some or a lot of uncodified knowledge in the key domains of their work. So whether or not we think it's true, it is certainly the perception that workers have that they have something unique that is valuable to their employer that they can retain if they were to leave. So then we can ask, to treated workers and control workers, if you were given an opportunity, how willing are you to do each of the following to share your specific skills with your employer? And of course, we can list many ways in which workers commonly share their skills. So would you give a recorded demonstration of your skills and workflows? Would you provide detailed documentation of your work? Would you participate in additional monitoring? And then for those who have personal communications that they claim are relevant for their employer, we're going to ask, would you be willing to share those unofficial communications, or would you be able to share your AI prompts that you've been using that have helped with your work? And here you can see the treatment group, which became slightly more aware of the relationship between how these data might help improve the models. They are more likely to be unwilling to provide these data. So it shoots up from something between 20 and 25% in the control group to over 30% saying they would be unwilling to provide those AI prompts, for example. The cheated workers are more likely to actually withhold knowledge. And the way we can do this in an incentivized way is by asking a similar question about the very survey data that we're collecting and could use to make a synthetic panel of survey takers. So if this makes sense, first, let me just describe how 51% of our respondents report that prolific income from taking these surveys make up over 10% of their total income, meaning that for many, this is a sizable chunk of money, and we're going to describe ourselves as researchers interested in creating synthetic panels of survey takers so that with enough data from any participant, we can replicate their preferences and answer questions the way they can answer their questions. And these models are increasingly popular and being built in various different settings. Even Prolific has been considering how to think about designing a synthetic panel. And of course, even for Prolific, the key tension is what will happen to the quality and willingness of survey takers to take surveys in the event that they are using those data to mimic those workers. So we're going to say we are interested in doing this, and then we ask workers about their willingness to supply the data on their surveys. So the question we ask is, are you willing to let us use your responses and metadata from your previous Prolific surveys for a bonus? And here the bonus is 3 times what we would pay for just that one survey, so $10. And we explained that for a share of the willing participants, we're going to pay the bonus and we're going to seek data on their past surveys from the collectors. Namely, we were planning to seek out those past data from Prolific with their consent. Now you can see that the share unwilling to provide those past data are rising in their awareness of how these data can be used. So for the treatment group that's aware of how we could use these data to improve model performance, they are significantly less willing to provide it. So 35% are leaving money on the table, leaving the $10 on the table because it doesn't take any extra work. They just have to consent. Now, something nice about the 30% withholding is that it actually, you can see how in the aggregate, 30% withholding can actually be quite damaging to the production of a synthetic panel because it introduces quite a bit of bias if you have 30% of your subject pool for reasons that are unclear, saying they're unwilling to offer that data. We also ask about future data withholding. What wage would you require to complete a 1-hour survey to learn more about your preferences? Whether we accept your proposal depends on your requested rate. And here you can see the share that require higher rates in the treatment group also goes up. So it's not just their past data, it's their future work. Now, why might workers withhold this knowledge? There's at least 3 explanations. The individual career concerns, I shouldn't train a model to replace me. A collective career concern, we shouldn't train a model to replace us. So sort of like this is somewhat having in mind, not just your own strategic response, but the other workers' strategic response and having a collective mentality. And then there could also be moral concerns. I don't like that companies use worker data without consent. Now, our survey, what I've shown you so far, doesn't clearly distinguish between 1, 2, and 3 here, but we have quite a bit of suggestive evidence that the career concerns are really salient. And the reason we can say that with some confidence is that when you can see how withholding is rising in people's individual expertise, the value that they perceive of their codified knowledge. So this is the type of relationship that you would expect with individual career concerns, but not necessarily moral concerns. Now, both are probably at play. Our model is going to focus on the first, so we're going to really focus on individual career concerns, and we can easily extend this model to include collective career concerns as well.
Okay. Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
Yes. So in the previous slide, you already mentioned this individual versus a collective, which
Yes.
also seems to be rather important for how we interpret the survey results, especially the mini experiment you had. So for example, for our individual, when we ask whether they want to share the individual data, they got this personal bonus, which is $10. But the potential cost is that you then, as researchers, they may think, oh, you can use my data for the model. But then how should we think about the cost, which is if they're thinking about this research team has to reach out to 10,000 people, my as an individual not holding my data actually have very marginal impact on the final result. So which means that this big impact that we saw means that they really don't want. So I think it's more about both on this, how should we think about this result, and also how should we think about in reality this individual and the collective seems to be super important.
I agree completely. And I think it's both. Let me just extend what you're saying. It also is related to what we think is probably optimistic perception that each individual has unique uncodified knowledge that the employer would lose if they left, rather than just immediately replacing them with somebody else who has similar knowledge, similar expertise. And all these things, so both the sense that they are unique and their perception that perhaps others are going to have this collective mentality is going to be, I think, very first order in whether or not individuals perceive they have any chance of getting surplus by protecting their own data. And that's going to be very clear in the model because we're going to think about the substitutability between workers as being first order to whether they can actually use withholding to increase their surplus at all. So I'm really happy you brought that up. And I think there's a lot of work to do on that front. Okay, so now let me just mention the types of policies that workers naturally gravitate towards. So we can ask the question, do you agree with this statement? So my employer pays me for my work. Therefore, they should have the right to the work products that I create on the job. So this is what we think of as like the status quo policy in most workplaces. And you can see that the vast majority of people agree with this statement in the control group and also the treatment group, but it shifts people from the categories of agree to the categories of disagree and strongly disagree. So it has a modest impact on the share of workers. I'm just showing you the treatment effect. So 36% higher likely to say that they strongly disagree, and 24% saying more likely that they disagree. So it shifts them away from status quo policy preferences. And then among the treated groups, we can ask them, okay, here are 3 types of policies that could be in place. Can you reflect on these scenarios and share with us how you would, which of these you prefer? And we have them compare each one of these to the status quo. So one is restricting data. So the employer cannot use work data to develop AI models at all. They would have to seek out different workers to train those models and pay them directly. Or you could think about individual worker control. So if you decide your data can be used for AI training, you can decide, and the employer is going to need your consent, and you have to agree on a price. And then this collective worker control option, you and other workers jointly decide whether your collective work data can be used for AI training. And this is just to show that, in fact, in this population, individual ownership is the policy with the most support. So this is the 67.3% bar in the middle is just showing the share that support it over the status quo. And you can see in red, there's still some share in each of these cases that just prefer the status quo over each one of these policies. So we're going to take the potential for individual ownership quite seriously in the model. We think that that's actually naturally what would arise from workers debating on which type of policy to go forward with. Okay, so let me now give you a sense of what the model is doing. So why might workers withhold knowledge when faced with AI? One answer, of course, is that they do it out of career concerns. Now, you might just think, well, we can pay workers to train the model. That would be a naive solution. The idea would be you can try to pay for knowledge contributions now, but workers are going to anticipate that the ones who are aware are going to anticipate that they get paid today, but it means that they could potentially be displaced tomorrow. So the kind of characteristics of the workplace that would make it hard to just pay workers to train the AI model have these 2 characteristics. One is limited contractibility. It's actually hard to specify exactly what the knowledge is that workers must provide. If it was fully specifiable, then the employer could just agree to a wage that's specific to exactly the expertise they're trying to elicit. The other characteristic is that there is limited commitment. If firms could just say, give me your knowledge today, and I promise to pay you exactly the way I would have anyways, I'm going to commit to a future wage of X for as many years going forward. If there's full commitment like that, then of course that you can also pay for the training of these AI models. But in most settings, at least in the US context, we have right to quit. We have limited commitment, so firms or workers can renegotiate after knowledge supply happens. And so it's these 2 features of the workplace that are important in the model and important for identifying the types of work environments where strategic withholding might happen. So the key model ingredients, there's going to be 2 periods. Why? Because period 1, workers are going to make a decision about training the data, and period 2 is when that training data can be used by a model. Then there's limited contractibility. So the knowledge provision you're going to see that the wage cannot be conditional on knowledge contribution within a period. So of course, like what happens in period 1 can affect what happens in period 2, and knowledge will be observable at the end of period 1, but the wage in period 1 cannot be conditional on exactly the knowledge extracted. And then there's limited commitment in the sense that the firm can renegotiate wages after surveilling the worker. So let me now describe the key takeaways in case I have to move quickly over certain parts of the model. So first is that with naive workers, surveillance increases social welfare. And for a fairly trivial reason, workers who are naive are just going to contribute their full knowledge to the AI system, and the AI system raises output, at least weekly. If it's better than any worker, then strictly. The second takeaway is that when you introduce awareness, it can actually lead to Pareto worse outcomes for the firms, for workers, compared to no surveillance. And the reason is that sophisticated workers can withhold their knowledge for fear of expropriation. And it's the ease with which they can withhold knowledge that's really going to determine just how damaging the kind of strategic response can be. and it can damage production to the present output. And the withholding also damages how effective the AI model is going to be in the future. And this is the way in which it could be worse for workers, firms, and society. And then the third takeaway is going to be that workers may not want what's best for them because, as Yulu was describing, if there is substitution in the knowledge supply of one worker versus another, individual ownership, which is what we thought workers wanted from our survey, can recoup efficiency, it can recover the knowledge contributions, but it might not be effective in improving workers' surplus or bargaining power because one worker's data, the marginal contribution might be quite small and has this externality on the negotiations of other workers. So we're going to see that collective ownership recovers efficiency, and it has this additional advantage if for fairness concerns of improving the worker surplus relative to firm ownership, which is our status quo and kind of our benchmark throughout. Okay, in the interest of time, I understand that it would be nice to have a Q&A, and so I've been targeting 9:15 as a good stopping point. So for that reason, what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight some of the setup for the model and maybe a few more key takeaways, and then try to conclude with the interest that some of the Q&A might actually be more beneficial for our understanding of the paper than maybe the details of the theorems that I'm about to would otherwise cover. So let me give you the key elements of the setup. So we're going to have one firm and a set of workers, J. As I mentioned, there's these two periods. There's the present and the future. Wages and employment are determined by Nash and Nash bargaining. And then after bargaining, hired workers are going to choose their knowledge contribution. And in the model, we denote it with K. So K superscript J and subscript T. And then their maximum contribution. Each worker has their own individual maximum, is going to be denoted with this hat above the K, a bar. And then workers can withhold knowledge at a cost. So it's costly to sandbag, and so there's this C of K, which is a cost function, which is continuous, non-increasing, and if they withhold 0, the cost is 0. And then, of course, withholding can, in practice, be many things. It can be evading surveillance or contaminating data or degrading documentation. The sequence of events, so firms bargain with each worker over wages and whether they're hired. Then each worker gets to choose their knowledge contribution. Then the knowledge contribution in period 1 is publicly observed. And then the firm bargains with each worker over what that wage in period 2 is going to be and whether they're hired. And lastly, then each worker chooses their knowledge contribution in the second period. So as you well know now, knowledge is not contractible because in that first period, K is not conditional on the wage. And there's limited commitment in that they can bargain over wage 2 after K is contributed. The worker payoff is going to be what they earn in period 1 and then discounted what they earn in period 2. So the wage minus the cost of withholding and in the first period, and then the same in the second period with this psi to discount for time. Now, you might think knowledge supply is going to be correlated with actual labor supply. The more work you do, the more data you see about the work. We are, for simplification, just going to say they are exactly the same thing. So your knowledge supply and your labor supply are one and the same. But of course, these two can move independently, and in some cases, quite independently. So like imagine you're doing a financial model, you can report a number without giving away necessarily what your model is. Okay, then what is equilibrium here? Well, equilibrium is going to be at each point in history, wages and employment determined by Nash and Nash, and then each worker conditional on being hired is going to contribute K that best responds to everybody else's contribution of K. And then we're going to focus on equilibria where in period 2, everyone just contributes their full knowledge. Why is that? Well, period 2 is very uninteresting in the sense that the knowledge you contribute in period 2 goes nowhere because there's no AI model in period 3. It's the finiteness that makes period 2 uninteresting. And then these are the cases we want to consider seriously. We want to think about our baseline, which is true for many of the workers in our survey experiment. This is where the workers are naive and firms have ownership over the data. Then we want to introduce awareness, so workers become sophisticated. And then we want to think about our 3 potential AI policies. Limiting the use of data. So this is like the longshoreman strike. then individual ownership of data, like the voice actors, and then collectively owned data, which we don't have clear precedent for, but we think is potentially possible. The Hollywood screenwriters might be the closest to that. Okay, and then now in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is talk about each one of these cases at a high level. So each proposition box has a lot of information in it, but let me just highlight the bullet points below the box. So in the pre-AI world, workers have no incentive to withhold knowledge. We understand that they don't know how it's going to be used. So time one and time two are fully separate. And this is the way in which workers rent their labor, and they're always going to maximize output and bargain for a share of it. So they're always just going to contribute full knowledge. Now, if you introduce surveillance, of course, the output for the overall production changes from being the sum of knowledge contributions in the two periods to being the maximum of either the sum of knowledge contributions or the performance of the model, alpha of K1. So that's the AI use of the knowledge that's been contributed in the first period. Okay, now there's functional form that many functional forms that this alpha can take. We make a couple of key restrictions that are grounded in the conceptual part of this paper, which is that we're going to assume that the data from one worker is substituting for another worker. So if workers are doing similar work, producing similar data, there's going to be a substitution where if you raise the knowledge contribution of one worker, it reduces the value of another worker's contribution. Okay, now think about introducing or comparing the full expropriation when workers are naive to the case where you have surveillance and that surveillance can be used to create a better AI. So with AI fully expropriating workers, wages in time two are going to fall because the firm's outside option has improved. When the firm's outside option improves in the second period, when they go to Nash and Nash bargain, workers' wages are going to fall. So output is going to weekly increase. If AI is better than any worker, it's going to fully increase. It's going to strictly increase, but the wages are going to fall in this context. Now, when you introduce knowledge or sophisticated workers, they anticipate that their wages are going to fall when the AI model gets better, and so time two wages are going to always. So relative to the naive case, once you introduce sophistication, those sophisticated workers can always keep time two wages higher relative to time one when they were naive, but profits and output are going to be lower in that second period. So I want to make a really important point here. Relative to no surveillance, it's not clear whether workers, firms, or society are better or worse off. It really depends on the conditions. And after this slide, I'm going to skip to what I think are the key conditions. So why is it unclear? Well, if there's high withholding, output in period one is going to fall, wages are going to fall, and that model in period two are not going to be is not going to be that productive. But in the case where the model is going to be extremely productive with a worker's knowledge, they can actually increase their time one. They can increase their time one wage because when they go to Nash and Nash bargain, their knowledge contribution in period one can be so valuable that the outside that the sort of the joint surplus that they split, even if the worker gets a smaller piece of it, is going to increase the wages that they receive. So really, because that can go in either direction, output is unclear and firm profits are unclear. In the interest of time, what I want to do is I want to talk about what I think are the key factors for this. So the elements in the theory, the key levers that are moving is one, how easy is it to withhold? So how easy is it for an employer to model a worker without their consent? And the other aspect in this model is the substitutability of data. How much does it matter that the data come from a particular worker? And we can think about the different types of jobs that fall under each of these categories. So cases where substitutability is low and cases where substitutability is high. So for example, call center workers, the data substitutability is high, and for actors and digital influencers, it's fairly low. And on the withholding aspect, we think that it's actually quite hard for people in Hollywood to withhold because much of their work comes in the form of footage and audio recordings that are hard to produce without just transferring it fully. And then on the other hand, work like mine, where I can choose whether to upload the video recording or not in the context of teaching. So performers and thought leaders, etc., or even lawyers and teachers and doctors with sort of tacit knowledge that's easy for them to withhold on the job. These are cases where you can really see the strategic component of this moving quite a bit. And in the theory that I didn't fully cover, what was the kind of, which the intuition might already be clear, is that when there's high substitutability, even if workers can withhold, their peers are going to potentially contribute data that then makes their own data irrelevant for improving the model. So as such, they can contribute, or sort of like as such, they have, because alpha was a function of the K contributed by all the workers, and because the value of the reason to withhold is to prevent the model from getting better. If your coworkers' data is already making the model great, there's no reason to withhold. And so in these cases with high substitutability, there would need to be collective action among workers in order for workers to have an incentive to both withhold, and then for firms to have an incentive to allow a transfer large enough to get full knowledge contributions. So these are the cases where we think collective action would be quite important. And then of course, when withholding is very hard here, that's another reason that would be again, like it would prevent workers from being able to be strategic in the context of their work. And then again, they would need some kind of collective action in order to sustain high wages. Okay, so I'm going to share with you the conclusion slide and then open it up to questions. Granted, it might mean that we go back to some more of the model slides later. All right, so what we want to do in this paper is describe how labor can be reconceived as a physical asset, and talk about the potential for productivity gains, of course, as human skills are codified and scaled, but noting that to get to this kind of productivity potential, we would need workers to actually be rationally sharing knowledge with the AI systems. And our findings from both the experiment and the theory is that you can actually think about AI performance as eroding as workers become aware of how their data contributions can impact their careers. And to the extent that workers are strategic about their knowledge supply, the contracting environment would have to change in order to get workers to really train high performance models. And then the other points that we want to make is that their proclivities are towards individual data ownership. And yet individual data ownership is only going to be effective at raising worker surplus in cases where workers are either not substitutable or withholding is very easy to achieve. And then, of course, collective bargaining helps internalize the externalities between any two workers, but of course has its own challenges for reasons that we're happy to get into. But of course, you can imagine even the collective has to decide who gets what. And so there's still quite a bit of friction to redistributing the kinds of gains from AI. Okay, let me pause there and see what people are interested in talking about next.
Thank you so much, Zoe, for this amazing presentation. Audience, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or even just speak up. I think we already have one question in the chat from Yang Jing. So Zoe, would you like to start with that?
Let me see if I can. I'm trying to see if I can.
Oh, can you
capture
see
the
it?
chat? Well, I'm opening it up now. Okay, great.
Okay, great. It's a pretty long question.
Okay, so must these experts never have any job again? This is a really excellent point. So I've talked about the strategic withholding of knowledge. I haven't spoken at all about the incentives to increase knowledge. So workers could potentially be quite strategic as well around dynamically gaining the type of expertise that they can sell again in the future. So, it might be that you hand over your knowledge to a particular employer and it captures kind of the time and place and clients of that particular employer. And so you've increased your firm's outside option relative to your own, and maybe they don't need to raise your wages as much, or maybe they don't need to hire you at all. But you have two options. One is to think about moving to another firm where you collect new local knowledge, or sort of developing different expertise that maybe even the same employer would want to pay for again in the future. And then the question says, in the future, in any enterprise of any country, there will be at least 3 or 5 employees, and most enterprises there will be only one person. Okay, so obviously the scale of like fundamental to the theory that I described is the degree of substitutability within any one firm. So it is true that we are seeing a lot of these tiny teams now, where the number of people within a firm who are direct substitutes has been declining. So that would definitely impact the degree of substitutability that we see. Let me read a little more. Okay, so somebody's interested in pay transparency here. Maybe we can talk offline, since the pay transparency is actually quite different from the work that I'm presenting now. Yeah.
Okay, anyone have other questions? If not, actually, I have one related question to this first one. Yeah, which is, I think overall, so if I understand correctly, so for example, in the model, there's one key assumption, which is how the firm use the data for output in the second stage, which is fully substitute. So I was wondering, because itself, I think currently, not only in reality, but also in research-wise, is a related open-ended question or debatable, because now some research is showing that sometimes AI models can be complementary to some type of worker. There's even very high level of heterogeneity. So I think overall, my question might be, first, overall, how you think about this assumption, how the model results are sensitive to this assumption. Not necessarily we have to make this complementary, because then the model result can be maybe totally different, but maybe even just heterogeneity. How should we think about in general?
Yes, thank you for that question. So so two things. One is sort of the premise for the surveillance being the key to the improvement of the model has built in some of the substitutability. So in the sense that, like, if the key data is just mimicking what the worker is actually doing, that tends to create the models that are substitutable in nature. Whereas the other generative models and maybe you're talking about this, that are actually trained on other data and combined with the worker skills. So a good example is, like, heart surgeons are creating like logs of diagnostic tools. Those diagnostic tools can be used to train a model of diagnosis, but even a more sophisticated model might use like mortality records that are distinct from that person, and combining maybe the diagnosis with these mortality records and finding things that the doctor couldn't even find themselves, if that makes sense. And that's where you get some like complementarities between the machine and the worker. Granted, though, I'm going through this example because you can kind of see how the worker's choice to withhold their data is not going to affect access to, say, the mortality records that help build this complementary tool. And so it's sort of outside the scope of what even that worker can do or think rationally about to withhold. And so to the extent we're trying to model like the worker's response over their knowledge supply, it sort of doesn't affect the production or performance of these models that are based on different data. So that's one point I wanted to describe. And so, so we don't speak at all to the use of other data. And then the second is that much of our model results hold if what we think about is the key source of complementarity, which has been shown say in the case of chat assistants, is taking the knowledge supply of the high-skilled worker and using that to complement lower-skilled workers. Then all the intuition of what I just described to you holds. It's just that instead of the outside option of the firm just being this alpha of K knowledge contribution, it involves hiring lower-skilled workers, if that makes sense. And then all of the intuition that I described to you holds. So in that form of complementarity is something that doesn't undermine the conclusions, but sort of like what would happen if the firm could use other data does affect withholding. It affects withholding in much the same way that there's a close substitute. And so, that's it would reduce the incentives to withhold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think we have a question from
Ginger, I see, right?
Yeah. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes. Yeah. Could you hear me?
Yes. Great to see
Okay. Yeah. Zoe, the paper is super interesting. I have a question about consent. Let's put aside the workers' union. Individual workers' consent remind me something similar to consumer consent.
Oh,
and
interesting. Yeah.
The privacy concern
Right.
by individual consumers is also similar to the workers' concern of their data being shared and used by someone else.
Yeah.
But we know from the consumer privacy literature that's providing a way for consumers to give consent. It ends up like consumers don't read the fine print and they give consent automatically. But on the other hand, they feel very anxious that their privacy got invaded, and they cannot help algorithm or other things that may create a price against them, right? So, I wonder whether that literature can have some spill over here, and to what extent that may change your model.
Yeah. I love the analogy. Is there so at the very end, you were just saying that so like contributing the data might improve an algorithm to price against the worker. Is there a paper that you recommend where that kind of negative externality is both salient to the worker and sort of like their response is incorporated?
Yes, there has been a bunch of theories, I think, about how algorithm may enable something close to first-degree price discrimination, and that could squeeze out any consumer surplus. I'm happy to send you a few references. I think most of the literature there are theoretical. An empirical one was documenting that consumers seems to be driven by some behavioral bias. They may say they care about privacy, but in their action, they end up sort of skipped all the readings and click the yes automatically and so forth.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of the, to the extent that workers are aware and the career concerns are salient, it's sort of first order for their reaction. And that's a totally open question if that's going to pan out the way we expect. It's clearly true in Hollywood, but there's something about having a guild that discusses these issues that I think is really kind of first order for them paying attention. Yeah. So
I mean, of course,
I feel like you might have had other observations that I cut you off from.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I can see theoretically how collective bargaining with frictionless union would work, but say we're talking about Hollywood movie making, the labor force might be globally, right? It'll be. I would imagine it will be very difficult to have a union representing all existing and potential actors, and eventually the firms will be able to find individual actors in somewhere else that is willing to allow themselves being tracked, and then
yes. This is you get it. So like the core decision that we had to make, which is to this is the ability for workers to come together and have an effective collective bargaining power hinges on whether there's really firm specific knowledge for exactly the reason you're describing. It's sort of like the institution itself is only really set up to kind of bring together workers who are in the same place and have so power over certain types of, and this is one distinction between the literature on consumerism and the collective bargaining over data as a consumer, because you don't have the kind of natural collective that might potentially offer new policies.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah, it's good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ginger.
Great. Given the time, Zoe, I think there's one last question in the chat. It's also kind of related to the union. I think it's more asking about the overall the economy-wide spillover. What should we think about?
Yeah, it's a very interesting example. So it reminds me of this early literature on unions showing that there's two types of unions that we would want as a society. One being fragmented workplaces, which don't have much power, and the other being a national union that internalizes these spillovers, both because a national union would internalize the impact of raising wages on something like unemployment and the cost to society, and also because of this exact, like many of the products that different production functions create have social externalities, including the one described here, these airline traffic accidents. I honestly think that, like, I'm working with lawyers on different solutions, and one of the most feasible solutions from their perspective is the national union model of collectively negotiate or like national professional societies that set norms and also potentially access to a cloud with these data. So this is, I think, kind of first order the social spillovers from the impact these unions will have. So thank you very much for that question.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Zoe, today again for this amazing presentation and for everyone for joining us today. And please stay tuned for future Luohan Academy webinars.